Hi, this is William Milbury, and this is my continuing series of videos about the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear crisis in northeast Japan. In my last video I talked about becquerels, the unit used to measure radioactive contamination in food, water, and other substances. And I also talked about how Japan changed the safety limits for the amount of contamination that can be in food and water. This time I'd like to talk specifically about radioactive contamination in green tea. I know this is old news, but I think it's a very clear example of the attitudes and policies of the Japanese authorities and agriculture industry when it comes to radioactive contamination in food. Several months ago, I believe it was May, Kanagawa Prefecture was testing their produce for radioactive contamination, and for whatever reason, green tea was exempt from this. They, however, wanted to make a safety declaration, so they went ahead and tested their green tea. I don't think they were really expecting to find anything because the rest of their vegetables were coming up pretty clean. But to their surprise, they found that a lot of green tea was over the safety limit for radioactive cesium. Now, if you remember from my last video, the safety limit for radioactive cesium is 500 becquerels per kilogram of food items. So they were testing not liquid green tea, but dried green tea, and it was over 500 becquerels. So they did the responsible thing, and they banned shipment of the affected tea. A little while after that, the Japanese government asked Shizuoka Prefecture, the country's main tea-growing region, to test their green teas. And the governor, Heita Kawakatsu, refused to cooperate. Okay, the government was asking Shizuoka to test the dried green tea, but he was insistent that the tea only needed to be tested at an earlier processing stage. Well, in the earlier processing stage, the weight is different, and it will register as having less contamination per kilogram because it weighs more. The governor said checking raw tea leaves and tea for drinking is enough. So he didn't want to test the dried green tea product. This was reported in the Mainichi Daily News' English website on May 19th. I saw this article, and I went back for a copy of it back in May, and it was gone. Fortunately, I found a copy of it in Google's cache. Now, I have to wonder if Shizuoka Prefecture didn't like the negative image that this article portrayed and asked the Mainichi Daily News to remove it. In Japan, harmony is very important, so if the government asks a news agency to remove an article, they'd probably consider it. Additionally, it's my understanding that most press conferences are not open to the public. Therefore, if a news agency wants to stay in good standing with the government and hence get invited to press conferences, they probably need to be cooperative. So I have to wonder about exactly why the article disappeared and the circumstances surrounding that. On June 19th, the Mainichi Daily News reported that 162 kilograms of dried green tea, which arrived in France, were detained and destroyed because they were found by the authorities there to be over 2 times the European Union's limit of radioactive cesium. This green tea from Shizuoka Prefecture, which had arrived in France, had over 1,000 becquerels per kilogram of radiation. In response to this incident and the disposal of the tea, Shizuoka Governor Heita Kawakatsu said he believes it would not pose any problem at all if the tea leaves are prepared as a beverage for drinking. So we can see that there is no conscience here and no respect for high safety standards. There seems to be a very strong emphasis on getting people to consume the product as long as it's below the Japanese safety limits, even if it does contain radioactive cesium. The situation actually deepens. All of Shizuoka Prefecture's major tea-growing regions were checked for radioactivity, and 8 of the regions tested positive for radioactive cesium in tea leaves. They were all in the hundreds of becquerels, with the lowest being 146 and the highest being 385 becquerels per kilogram. Now, as long as the radioactive iodine and radioactive cesium are below the safety limits, it's okay to sell the food. So if green tea, for example, has 499 becquerels per kilogram, well, it can be put on the market as normal with no special markings or anything. This is problematic for two reasons. Number one, consumers who choose to avoid consuming radiation have a very difficult time in doing so, because you don't know if the product is going to have radiation in it or not. So this is a typical bottle of green tea that you can get at a vending machine or grocery store, and it only says Kokusan on it, which means made in Japan. It doesn't say where the tea leaves are from. Now, just about every food product in Japan does have an address on it of the company responsible for it. However, this case, as in many, it's listing a business office in Tokyo. A huge amount of Japanese products list a business office in Tokyo. So you can't say exactly where the green tea leaves in here came from and if it's radiation free or not. The same goes for other tea products. This is from a different company. And once again, it says, let me find it, here we go, Genzairyo mei, original ingredient name. It says cha, tea in Japanese, and then behind it in parentheses it says Nihon. Okay, so this is once again just documented as being tea from Japan, but it doesn't really say where in Japan. Okay, and the other problem with the testing for cesium and iodine is that every scientist knows there is a plethora of other toxic radioactive substances which have been released from Fukushima. These include uranium, plutonium, strontium, tritium, and many other substances. But yet, cesium and iodine are the only ones that the authorities talk about regularly, and I strongly suspect that they're the only ones being tested for. And as you remember from my last video, Japan does have a legal limit of plutonium and uranium. But I have to question if they're being tested for because you don't hear about them. One sickening example of how contaminated products are being sold on the market is the Ohkuraen tea company in Shizuoka Prefecture. They have an English web page which proclaims the safety of their tea. And to support this, they have 2 official lab documents posted on this web page. Do you know what these documents show? The one document shows that one sample of tea measured 175 becquerels per kilogram if you sum the 2 isotopes of cesium together. And the other document shows that the other test came back with 107 becquerels per kilogram. So this is below the Japanese government safety limit, and this company is selling their tea and proclaiming its safety just because it tested below the limit. But never mind the fact that it does contain radioactive cesium. And I don't know, in my opinion, to kind of add insult to injury, below the documents it states, "Because we would like our customers to stop worrying about radiation influence as soon as possible." This is an attitude that I've seen many times since this incident began. There is a very strong emphasis on making people not worry about the radiation by telling them that it's safe, by focusing on the safety limits rather than focusing on trying to produce products and food without any radiation in it. Another example of how radioactive products are in the Japanese market comes from a June 10th article from the English Japan Times Online. Shizuoka Prefecture told a Tokyo-based mail-order company called Radish Boya to not disclose findings about radiation in tea to consumers. They said that it would cause unwarranted harm to Shizuoka tea growers. Well, Radish Boya fortunately did the responsible thing, and they notified their customers that the tea might have radiation in it, and they offered to recall the products. So my hat goes off to Radish Boya. Also, there are some other tea vendors who on their website have indicated that they're currently selling old stock until they get a handle on the situation, or they're just refusing to sell tea that has radiation in it. So this isn't every Japanese vendor. However, some are. And like I pointed out, when you go to buy tea, unless it's a regional brand or a very high-end brand, this everyday stuff that you get in the grocery store or out of vending machines, you can't really be certain where the tea leaves came from, which makes it very difficult to avoid the radiation if you're like me and have decided to not accept the Japanese safety limits and to do what you can to avoid ingesting it. So Kanagawa Prefecture is southwest of Tokyo, some 250 kilometers, 156 miles away from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. And Shizuoka Prefecture is even further away, some 300 kilometers away from the Fukushima nuclear plant. This is way outside of the exclusion zone. So why is the amount of radioactive cesium in the green tea so high? How did it get contaminated? Soil samples from the area don't reveal a high level of contamination. Well, according to Yasuyuki Muramatsu of Gakushuin University, he believes that the thick foliage of the green tea plants absorbed a large amount of radioactive cesium out of the air after the initial explosions, which released very large plumes of radioactivity. These plumes of radioactivity blew around Japan, and in places where it rained or snowed, the radioactive substances settled out. They fell out of the air and contaminated the ground. Well, this didn't really happen in Shizuoka, but the tea leaves absorbed it from the air. New tea leaves draw their nutrients from old tea leaves, so then the new growth concentrated the cesium. But this brings up the question, what about the people living in the area? What about the millions of people living in Tokyo? If the radioactive plume contained enough radioactive substances such that plants could suck it out of the air and become contaminated, what about all of the people breathing there? Most modern technological countries, such as the United States and most of Europe, have the ability to monitor and track a radioactive plume in the event of an accident or even an attack. The plume location can be tracked, and citizens can be warned to stay indoors, to evacuate, or take other steps to protect themselves. Japan has such a system. It's called SPEEDY. However, after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear crisis began, the officials didn't know how to use the system or even what to do with the information created by it. As one result of this incompetence, residents in the town of Namie were actually evacuated into the path of a radioactive plume released by Fukushima on March 12th, according to the Associated Press, and they suffered additional and unnecessary radiation exposure as a result. I myself wanted to know where the plume was from the earliest moments of the first releases, but the information was nowhere to be found. As a result, I found myself searching the net, looking at various weather websites and looking at airflow patterns in Asia and trying to make guesses about my own safety. This is just green tea, but logic says that it can't be the only agricultural product that's been affected. You may have heard the news about the radioactive beef which was sold and consumed all over Japan. That is a whole other topic requiring its own video. As we can see, products with radioactive contamination can and are being sold legally in Japan and almost certainly exported. The jury is currently out on the effects of low-dose radiation. Some people claim that there are no health effects from it, and other people say that it does lead to extra cancers and health issues and is a major concern. I urge everyone to be cautious and to do what I'm doing, and that's be as informed as possible and do everything that you can to avoid products that may contain radioactive contamination. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in the future with more information. Take care of yourself.